The winter mud had frozen into a hard, rust-colored shell, and the Germans kept moving into a landscape that suddenly did not belong to them the way it had the year before. When the first Su-100 slipped into the light of a pale dawn, it did not announce itself with the slow, ponderous bulk of a Tiger I or the arrogant frontal armor of a Panther. It was low, almost furtive, a dark wedge moving behind a ridge. And for the men who saw it that morning on a ridge outside a burned-out village, the emotion was a cold, precise thing. Disbelief that such a small machine could carry so much deadly intent. That disbelief, repeated up and down the Eastern Front in 1944, is the single thread of this story. How a lean Soviet tank destroyer rewrote expectations and produced kill ratios that left German commanders staring at their own doctrine and production schedules, uneasy and suddenly very mortal. The Su-100 did not arrive fully formed as a miracle. It was the product of a simple, almost brutal logic. German tanks were getting heavier, their guns longer, their frontal armor angrier. The Soviets could not match that trend by building ever bigger tanks without tearing open their fragile industrial balance. Instead, they took a known chassis, the reliable medium tank underpinnings that factories could churn out, and placed on it a 100mm high-velocity gun in a fixed casemate-style superstructure. The result was not graceful, but it was efficient. A devastating punch on a chassis that was cheap to make and quick to repair. For tank crews who had spent months in cramped T-34s, the Su-100's interior was equally uncomfortable. But the promise of survival rested less on crew comfort and more on the ability to kill the enemy before he killed you. What surprised German crews first was range and accuracy. The 100mm gun arrived with a ballistics profile that let experienced Soviet gunners take aim at Panthers, and even Tiger I's, from positions the Germans regarded as safe. Suddenly, the familiar maneuver, approach, bring the heavier gun to bear at mid-range, exchange fire, was inverted. German commanders found their tanks burning from hits that came from beyond the effective range of their own weapons. The psychological effect of that reversal must not be underestimated. Tank commanders are gamblers who like to force the contest into a fight where their odds are known. The Su-100 stole their odds, and in combat, that often means stealing victory. There were engineering quirks that the Germans did not expect, and that become one of the hidden gems of this story. The casemate mounting, though it gave up turret traverse, lowered the silhouette, and lower is life on the battlefield. The 100mm gun used a long, efficient barrel and benefited from an unexpectedly good sighting system adapted from existing artillery optics. The Soviet crews learned to use defilade and hull-down positions with a discipline that belied their reputation for reckless mass assaults. When a Panther or Tiger rumbled over a ridge, expecting to spot a squad of T-34s, the Su-100 was already aimed from a concealed position, the geometry favoring the ambusher. In that moment, the German crew's world narrowed to smell and smoke, and the violent jolt as armor failed. Another less obvious surprise was logistics and ammunition. The 100mm round, though heavier, proved to be easier to stow safely in the lower casemate than in a turret bustle. Crews could carry a mix of rounds that allowed them to choose either high explosive for soft targets or armor-piercing for hardened ones, with less fuss than on some German designs, where stowage became a life-or-death puzzle. Combine that with Soviet priorities, train crews to fire fast, not to pamper their tanks, and to accept mechanical failure as inevitable. And you get vehicles that were not delicate masterpieces, but effective tools. It turns out, in those last hard months of 1944, tools beat masterpieces. The human side of that calculus sharpened when the German reaction turned from bewilderment to fear. Imagine a Panther commander supervising a refit by a roadside. The tree trunks black with shell scars, the air metallic with spent propellant, the ground already littered with spent track pins. He listens for the faint, different kinetic note of a 100-millimeter shell impacting, a thud, a sharp gasping of ripped valves, and he knows the hit was not a glancing blow. He feels the heat, the shock, the way a splintered radio or a crushed turret ring ends a crew's ability to coordinate. Men who had once joked about Soviet tactics now spoke in clipped tones, counting ranges on a map and changing patrol routes. The Su-100 taught a brutal lesson. The outer shell of steel could be pierced by a weapon that arrived at a time and place of the Soviet choosing. The middle of the story brings the aha that rearranges the reader's assumptions. It was never merely the gun or the low profile. The Su-100's real advantage was that it completed a tactical concept the Red Army had begun to refine during the Kursk aftermath: combine deep reconnaissance, forward observers, and buried assets to create pockets of lethal surprise. The 100mm gave them the means to kill the heavy German tanks. The doctrine and the willingness to leave a vehicle behind if it meant destroying a Tiger one were the temperament shift. When a Soviet scouting party found a weak flank and called in a pair of Su-100s, the result was not a lucky shot, but the culmination of reconnaissance, timing, and a gun that could reach out and punish. German formations were designed to face threats head-on. They were far less prepared to face an enemy that put the first shot on their terms. A typical crescendo occurred on a November morning when a company of Su-100s lay in wait as a German armored column crossed frozen fields. The air was a hard blue, and frost cracked under boots. The Soviet crews had spent the night listening for engine tones, plotting lead and drop, and their commander, exhausted but steady, signaled the green that meant fire. The first 100mm rounds came out like thunder. The column's leading Panther sagged. Its turret ring shattered. Smoke swallowed the road. In the close, cold minutes that followed, the German infantry tried to deploy. The artillery tried to find the arc, but the Su-100s had already shifted to new defilade. The killing, clinical and quick, left German officers counting losses and asking why their supposedly superior armor had been rendered so vulnerable. That scene, repeated in variations across the front, explained the rising kill ratios, deliberate placement, decisive fire, and the ability to withdraw before return fire corrected the mistake. By the end, the payoff is sobering. The Su-100 did not win the war by itself. It did, however, force a recalculation that soaked into German planning. Their heavy tanks remained formidable, but the balance of risk had shifted. More tanks in the German force were being left burning along roads, not because they were caught by chance, but because men with maps, trained eyes, and a 100mm gun chose the moment. The Soviet wartime industry could produce these machines in numbers that mattered. They were not the solitary masterpieces the Germans prized. Factories that could not build a Tiger one in tens of thousands could build hundreds of Su-100s. And on a bleak battlefield in 1944, numbers married to an effective design produce lethal arithmetic. In the end, the lesson left on those frozen fields and in the ruined towns is precise and unforgiving. The Su-100 shocked German armies not because it was a miracle, but because it embodied a disciplined answer to a brutal question. When technology, tactics, and production line met on the battlefield with a clear purpose, it changed the terms of engagement. The men who climbed out of burning Panthers and tried to explain what had happened to their superiors could not deny the simple truth. The front had moved, and with it, the fragile certainty that armor alone would save a crew. Decades later, farmers still find bits of shell and metal in those fields. The scars remain, and with them, the quiet memory of a low silhouette on a ridge, the flash of a muzzle, and a doctrine that turned a modest gun into an instrument that shocked an army into rethinking how it fought.